Hi, fam. My name is Erin Caitlin, and I'm a strong advocate for sustainable growth and development. Part of this advocacy, which I apply to my everyday life, has led me to take steps that elevated my personal finance journey as an independent young professional. After hitting the milestones that I've set, even in the midst of a pandemic and recession, I'm sharing this system that worked for me in the hopes that it could help you too and contribute to promoting financial literacy. As a disclaimer, I am by no means a licensed financial advisor or analyst. I'm simply just sharing my experiences and what I have discovered. So please do consider those facts and conduct your own research while practicing due diligence. So let's begin. We're starting off first with mindset before we move into the technical aspects. Ask yourself why, then quantify it. Why do you need to have savings? Don't just stop at kasi kailangan or pang emergency or kasi gusto kong bilhin ang para kay, as that won't really get you that far. Those are just merely blanket statements that you're programmed to say because it's the norm. It's also a short-term, one-time statement that doesn't frame your mind to think of the events that will happen afterwards. For my case, I decided that I needed to have a certain amount of savings because I wanted to live a stable and comfortable life. I wanted to be able to provide that life for my own family, and I wanted to ensure that I can keep giving and having a secure and quality living without having to constantly make difficult decisions or be in uncomfortable situations due to financial constraints. So then this whole process of me saving got rooted into what was important to me, which then motivated me, and because it's a continuous cycle incorporated with a long-term goal, this system ensures that I'll be able to stick to the milestones that I've set. Speaking of which, set your milestones through exact numbers and set the deadline. For me, when I started working, I told myself that I need to have at a minimum 100,000 pesos in savings after a year. Money is a tool. So there's a saying that money is the root of all evil. If you think like that, you'll consider money as an enemy, and it's only natural to not want to have, see, or multiply your enemies, which means you'll subconsciously treat your cash inflow like that as well. But money is neither your enemy, nor is it a friend or a goal. In exchange of having value, we give value in return. So if you want to eat, for example, you give the corresponding value of the food you eat in exchange of having the value of filling your beast of a stomach and nourishing your body. Money is just the means to acquire what you need and help achieve what you want to do. Don't idolize it or romanticize it any further than that. And now we go into the technical aspects. We'll start off first with determining your risk appetite and strategy. Your risk appetite will shape your strategy. How much risk you can and are willing to take is largely influenced by two things: your natural behavior and your circumstances. On a scale, there are 5 types of risk profiles. Some of us are more adventurous than others. These are our comrades that can fall under the risk aggressive, and if they're in their early adulthood with no dependents and have parents or a family there to back them up, then they can actually afford to be very risk aggressive, meaning they can lose all their money and still be okay. On the other hand of the spectrum, a highly adventurous retiree who still has grandchildren that's being financed will still likely fall in the conservative range, as even if their natural behavior leans on being risk aggressive, their circumstances won't allow it. On the other hand, a careful couple in their 30s with children and stable income can afford to have a bit of risk through investments. However, because they still have children to care for, they can't afford to lose all of their money, and so they could fall under the balance category. Determining your risk appetite is crucial to building your strategy. I'll explain that through an anecdote. I'm a young, independent professional, which would have in other cases automatically classified me as risk aggressive. However, upon further introspection, since I am independent and just starting out, I have no other fallback plan. Meaning, I don't have parents that would provide for me in case I cannot pay for my bills anymore or I can't eat anymore. I also didn't have a lot of things that I needed when I was starting out for work. I still needed to have a functioning phone, a laptop, and all my college belongings were actually either too broken already or, just didn't fit me anymore. So that means that I'm pretty much still in that acquisition phase. On top of that, I had a fund that I had to contribute to monthly as I don't just work for myself. All of this basically adds to the reason why I cannot afford to lose all my money. As much as possible, I can't afford to lose money. So my risk appetite leans more on the conservative side. And now here comes the strategy. Let's make it simple. Savings is different from investments. Investments are designed to appreciate capital. However, investments can't usually be immediately liquidated. They can't be withdrawn from an ATM when an emergency happens and you need money right now. So when you're risk aggressive, go invest. You should ideally invest the money you can afford losing because more often than not, the higher the risk, the higher the return. And when we want to earn big. However, the possibility of losing all that and more is still present, especially when it comes to investments as volatile as the stock market or cryptocurrency. You should ideally invest the money you don't need anytime soon, as when it comes to earnings from bonds or treasury bills, time is the essence of interest earned, and if you invest, in time deposit accounts or mutual funds, withdrawing too quickly might cost you penalties. Now, if you're like me and you're risk averse, your strategy will be more focused on capital preservation, prioritizing liquidity, and there's nothing wrong with that. So many people will tell you that you need to have an investment, any investment, now, but so many people don't actually live in your shoes. They do not know what you need to do in order to survive. And if you're at a point in your life where you need to be prepared and have the bulk of your cash withdrawable when needed, and that just won't be possible if majority of your cash is in investments, then so be it. This is merely a stepping stone to the rest of the financial journey ahead. Unfortunately, so many people go into debt trying to garner so-called assets and investments as they believe this is good and the more the merrier. However, your strategy needs to be in line with your current and honest condition. You won't sustainably get to the point of having diverse investments until you have a solid foundation of savings. So keep that in mind. Track it. I've noticed that the ones who always ended up broke were the ones that didn't know what was happening to their money. A solution to that is to just record your transactions. There are several tutorials on how to make spreadsheets on this, though my personal preference and what has worked for me to keep me tracking my finances daily is having an app. I've used a lot of apps over the years, but the one that I ended up using the most for over 3 years now is the Money Manager app. It's simple, it's easy, and so it lessens the difficulties of record keeping. I recently bought the Pro version and I highly recommend it. Other notable apps are Expense IQ, Money Lever, and Good Budget Planner. Things to look out for when using budgeting apps is the ability to export data into Excel, so when you need to make a spreadsheet, you'll have your data readily available. Some people benefit from setting budgets, which would help ensure that you don't overspend, and the apps I mentioned all have that. Categorize your savings. There is more than one type of savings that will vary from person to person. In my case, I have three. Emergency savings are the savings that I allocate for unforeseen or unexpected events. I don't spend it otherwise. Included in my emergency savings would be the cushion that I use to transition from one job to another. Planned savings are the savings allocated for foreseen events that are essential. So these are the savings that I use to buy my phone, my laptop, my appliances, the things that I needed. Personal slash free to spend savings. These are the savings that I allocated for foreseen events that are non essential. Things like me wanting a new bag, even if I have one already, or the like, would fall under this category, as even if I could use this for work, this would merely be an upgrade and isn't something that I actually need yet. On a monthly basis, according to the milestones I've set to hit in a year, I put in money to these savings that I keep in three separate accounts. How I use the system for 2020 in order to grow over 100,000 in savings is as follows. For my emergency fund, I set aside 8,500 monthly as soon as I got my salary. Emergency funds are mandatory. A lot of the times, falling into the promise of certainty, which I'll discuss in a bit, we think that everything will be okay since we're employed now or we're healthy now. But there are moments where no matter what you do right, it's not your actions solely that determine the outcome. So you have to be prepared or you're going to end up stressed and in debt. For my planned savings, I took the price of whatever I needed and divided it by how many months I'm targeting to save for. So if the appliance costs 50,000 for example, and I'd want to buy it within the next 6 months, I'd have to set aside about 8,334, or if I want to buy it sooner within 4 months, I have to set aside 12,500 monthly. Generally, because I'm still in the acquisition phase, the bulk of what I save would go into my personal savings. Once I'm set on what I need, the bulk of my savings will then go towards the emergency fund. Then for my personal savings, it's the same as my planned savings, but I generally don't give myself as much of a timeline on this because I prioritize what is essential. I usually put in about 5,000 monthly for my personal savings, and it's free to spend as it is. I used to not believe in having this kind of fund available, as I once thought that in life, you've got to hustle hard until you die, as there was no room for anything else, especially indulgence and luxuries, unless you are born into a family that could provide that. However, I started having a self-care routine where I treat myself and found out that when I'm cared for, well provided, and at peace is when I can achieve the most and get to contribute the best. So I normalize tending to those needs and wants to help save parts of myself so I don't end up depleted. Though keep in mind that there are times when we try to save too much and cut corners. That only costs more money in the end to fix. Like when you think not eating or eating instant noodles only would help you, but the medical bills that follow when your body inevitably crashes might not only cost you all you have, but more than that. It's best to learn how to keep a balance on what you save and spend up for to ensure that you are functioning at your optimum levels. Don't forget this. At the end of the year, whatever remained or whatever I did not spend in my planned and personal savings are transferred into an emergency fund. Guidelines I adhere by. Whatever is left from my income after I have already saved is what I use to allocate into my investments, and what's left after that is what I use to pay for my daily expenses. Generally, the principle I strictly adhere by is that if I can't comfortably pay for what I'm buying in full, then I can't afford it. Thus, I don't go stressing into debt trying to acquire what I need or want. Honorable mentions. When dealing with debt, to prevent being buried in it, prioritize paying off the debt first. After someone sent me to the hospital with a hemorrhage and blood poisoning, I was buried in medical bills that surpassed what I saved after graduation when I prepared an emergency fund to help me transition from being a fresh grad to being employed. What I did, though, was that I borrowed some money to help pay off my bills, and then as soon as I got my job, the first thing that I would put my salary on is to paying off my debt. After I paid off my debt successfully, I started rebuilding my savings, and then I started increasing those savings. After my savings, I would put money into investments. After investments, then the rest of what was left to me would go into paying for the daily expenses. Banking. I'm shifting into putting my emergency funds in a readily withdrawable, high yielding savings account to make sure that my money doesn't depreciate in value while I haven't used it yet. To do this, I enrolled in a digital banking service through GCash's GSave that offered 4% per annum rates in comparison to the 3.5% inflation rate that 2020 closed off to for users 18 to 25 years old, though they also have other promos available, so just check that out. From GSave, I made a PDIC insured CIMB account. The monthly interest I receive for having my money deposited there is higher than traditional banks. The rate that your money grows needs to be as high or even higher than inflation to prevent your money from being worth less than when you first saved it. For my planned and personal savings, I still keep these both in separate traditional bank accounts, so when I need to spend, it's easy and convenient. The system I shared above works. It worked to help me save my first 1,000 pesos. It worked to help me save my first 10,000 pesos. It worked to help me save my first 100,000, and I'm going to use that also to help me save my first million. However, no matter how dedicated you are in doing what I just mentioned, the system won't work for you if you keep going into what I like to call the land of no return and the promise of certainty. The land of no return. Allowing people to borrow money will be easier when you don't expect it back. Trust me. Besides one or two people in my life, when I lend money, it never comes back to me. I'll even experience the person I lent money to getting mad at me because I ask for the money back, or they'll never show themselves to me again unless they're part of the group that will keep promising to pay back at a certain date. Then, when that date passes, they pick another date until eventually months and years go by. You're never gonna see your money again, basically. So, I only lend what I can lose. If they pay it back, that's great. If they don't, I won't be bothered. Other transactions that involve you paying out money that would most likely lead to a certain loss is part of the land of no return. If you keep going there, you won't have anything left to save and spend. The promise of certainty. When I first entered my job post graduation, I, like many other people, thought that I'm set and secured already since I'm employed. I had already experienced waiting months just to receive my salary, which only got aggravated more after the pandemic when majority of funds were allocated to COVID relief. It also didn't help that I was constantly getting power tripped by people who would pretend to be nice and friendly, so I'd end up getting gaslighted, and it was difficult to hold accountability against those that wouldn't stop washing their hands clean, as if they did nothing at all with all the damage that was being done, which ultimately worsened my situation. And I found myself 9 months in without an emergency fund anymore, without a salary, while my mental, physical, and emotional health plummeted. Like, I was in really bad shape. If I feel bad for the people that had to deal with me during that time. But thank you. My initial emergency fund that I started building during college, and the ones that I started building after I started receiving some of my salary, was depleted. And I started pulling out whatever money I could salvage, if I could salvage anything at all, from my investment and other funds I had set aside for specific people and purposes. When that didn't suffice, I started needing to borrow money, and then, I just basically repeated the same pattern where as soon as I got funds, I'd start paying that off. It was so scary to be in a situation like that, and I kept wondering why I allowed that to happen, only to realize that I held on to the promise of certainty. I held on to the promise that because I rendered services, I would get paid, not considering other factors that might come in the way, including the very real possibility of not getting my full salary. I really loved what we were working towards, so that made me want to stay, despite the already toxic environment and having my payroll account closed due to months of it being zero balanced. At the end of the day, I kept trying to convince myself that it's fine and I'll make it through. One thing I learned painfully is that being employed is not enough, and it does not guarantee your stability and security. A very complacent thinking because things should be fine is a very dangerous mindset. Even if the situation was different, the pandemic saw thousands of people lose their jobs and not get paid, ultimately being deprived of the only source of income that they and their family had depended on. So many people went hungry, so many people couldn't afford getting sick, so many people just didn't get up anymore. It's nice to hope for the best and believe promises of certainty, to go with thinking positively. But it's smart to prepare for the worst and create counter strategies to ensure that even if your company stops operating today, you'll have enough to continue going on for you and those that depend on you. I hope you found the content that I shared helpful, and if you did, please share it too. Moving forward, I'll be focusing my 2021 on building more emergency savings and creating multiple sources of income. You're welcome to join me.